This video is just going to show you some basics on getting started with your panel making, and it's going to show you back stitch, running stitch, and then also the basics of threading your needle and just attaching one piece of fabric to another. So you're probably more likely at home to have this type of thread, so it's like slightly thinner, like machine thread. You can use it for hand sewing as well, and you'll be able to use it with these two stitches that I'm going to show you. You just won't get as much volume and texture as you would do with these thicker threads. If you are using a thin thread like this, you'll need to use a thinner needle with a smaller eye at the top. So your embroidery needles will have a pointy end, but you just need to make sure you're using a thinner needle like this for a thin thread, so you don't puncture a hole in the fabric that's bigger than the thread thickness, if that makes sense. For thicker embroidery threads, you can use a needle like this. So this is a chenille needle. Again, it's got a pointy end, it's got a slightly larger eye at the top, and it is slightly thicker as well to hold. This is like a twisted, but it's multiple yarns that are twisted together. So this type of yarn you wouldn't be able to split. You'd have to keep it like this thickness, but you can see where it's like a twist when you look up close to the yarn. And then this type of thread as well, which you can quite commonly buy in like embroidery thread packs, is quite useful because you can use it this thickness that it comes in, but it's also made of 6 separate threads which you can easily split by hand, so you can stitch with a thinner thread if you want to, or a thicker one, or just make your embroidery thread last longer. So I'm just going to try and split it in half. If you make sure you just do it gently and slowly, because you'll see it spiral when you try to split it, and if you do it too quickly you can just twist it up and accidentally knot it. So I've got like 4 of the yarns here, and then you want to tie a knot at the end. So how everyone ties their knots slightly different, but I just make a loop between my forefinger and thumb and then bring the end of the thread up through that loop and then tie the knot. And you want to try and make, I'd normally do a double knot just to be safe, and you want to try and make that knot land on the previous one you did, so you've got one double knot. And then this extra bit at the end you just snip off, and you can keep all these extra bits as well. I normally keep them if you've got like an empty jar or something, because you can use them for stuffing material or just anything in your project. And then with the other end, because obviously it's multiple threads, you want to try and get it into the needle all in one go, so it doesn't, half of it's not like in the needle, not in the needle. And the way to do that is you can wet the end of the thread if you want to, or you can just pinch it if you keep pulling it so that like it's mostly between your thumb and forefinger, and then just let it go so it comes out of the needle. See where I did that I went slightly wrong because not all of them have come through the needle, so I'm just going to start that bit again. It's good to sort of make mistakes because then I can show you how you can overcome those mistakes. So you've got your fabric hooped up. It's good to have your fabric in a hoop if you're doing embroidery, because it will keep your stitches like nice and flush to the fabric and tidy on the fabric. Because what I've seen when people are just starting to stitch a lot is they just keep wanting to turn it over so they can see where they're going to put their needle, but you want to get used to holding it so that you've got the face of the embroidery in front of you, and then you just get used to like sort of gauging where your hand is putting the needle through, so you can just poke the point of the needle through. So you're up through the back and out through the front, and you want to pull it all the way, not too tight, not too hard, because you don't want it to come through actually all the way. And that's where your knot comes in useful, because it's blocking it from coming all the way through. So to do your first stitch, wherever you put the needle, so obviously choose your direction. So if you wanted it to point upwards, you go up here somewhere. If you wanted it to point, I'm just going to go along. And wherever you put the needle into the fabric next is how long your stitch is going to be. So I'm just going to start by making it that long. So you're putting the needle through the fabric, front, out through the back, and you're pulling it all the way so that the stitch is flush with the fabric. Again, you don't want to pull it too hard so that you break the thread, or just like pull it. You don't want to like stress the fabric out. And then your next step for running stitch is leaving a gap. So if you want your gap to be the same size as your stitch, you can do that by sort of just poking the needle out like you did before. They don't have to be the same sizes, you can make your stitches different sizes. But you're leaving that gap. And then doing the same thing that you did before with the first stitch. So you'll see that running stitch is essentially going over the top and then back to underneath, and then where your gap is on the front is where a stitch is on the back. So your thread is sort of weaving in and out of the fabric like a worm. To tie off your thread, because if you just left this now, so I've taken the needle out, if you just left this, there's a chance that it might just unravel. Like, the stitches are quite tightly put into the fabric, but there is still just a chance that it might unravel. So if I put my needle, if you keep your needle on the thread, and then what you do is you go to your nearest stitch, and then you're just putting it, you're sliding it underneath the nearest stitch, but not all the way. And then you're putting the needle head through the loop that you've just left, like that, and then you're going to pull it tight. So I normally do 2, so my needle just came off again, but I can just easily pop it back on. Yeah, I'm going to do 2 so that I'm making like a double knot. So then that's nice and secure, and then I've got this extra bit, so this is what I was talking about by keeping your offcuts, because that, if you think about how much stitching you might do and how many offcuts that you end up having, it's good to not let them sort of go to waste. So you can see at the moment the back's like nice and tidy, and it basically just looks like a reverse, doesn't it, of the front. There's a shorter bit of thread because I'm going to do a slightly smaller amount of back stitch. And then you're coming up through the back, out through the front. And then you're starting off, so that's how long I want my first stitch to be. You start off by just making a stitch. And then similar to running, well, the same as running stitch at the moment, you're coming up through the back again, like out through the front, the distance you want your next stitch to be. So instead of that gap being left like a gap in running stitch, that is going to become a stitch in that space. And then you go back into the end of your first stitch, or your last stitch that you did. Okay, so you're basically just going back on yourself. So this has more, it's probably slightly stronger than running stitch, because when you're going back, you're almost doubling up, because obviously underneath you've got the back of the stitching as well. So it's probably slightly stronger. So if you want a stronger bond of stitching, it might be better to use something like back stitch rather than running stitch. But then if you like this idea of having gaps, then it's also nice to use running stitch as well. if you've got pins, you can pin that on gently, just with one pin, so that it stays in place. If you don't have pins, you can also, when it's a small bit of fabric, just hold it into place. If it's a large piece of fabric, you could tack it with a running stitch, but really big running stitches, and then unpick it afterwards. So I'd already tied my knot on this one, that's why I've already been able to start stitching with it. So I'm going to do back stitch, I think, for attaching it. So you'll see where the fabric's jumping up, but you can just hold it into place with your thumb. So both these stitches are really good to use for sort of outlines, edges and borders, or if you wanted to use one of these to make a pattern to fill a space, you could also do that. You can also use it for text. If you were doing letters and you wanted just a line for the letters or the font, then you can also use it for that as well. But they're two very common basic stitches that I'd say are very good to start off with if you are a beginner, or if you are just looking at building the beginning of your panel. If it's joining layers together just for your background, then these are very good stitches to start off with.